They say Rome fell in the year 476, but for Britain, the end came long before. In the year 410, a message arrived from the Emperor Honorius in the distant city of Ravenna. The legions were gone. The empire could no longer protect its northern province. The Britons would have to look to their own defense. It was a quiet ending. No climactic battle, no desperate last stand. Simply the withdrawal of soldiers, administrators, and tax collectors, and with them the world that Rome had built. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain had been shaped by Roman power. Stone towns rose across the landscape, connected by straight roads and guarded by mighty forts. Latin was the language of law and government. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, had begun to flourish under imperial rule. The island was not Rome itself, but it was Rome's child. And yet, in a single generation, that world began to vanish. Without legions to defend the frontiers, the walls were left to crumble. Without governors to enforce the law, old tribal rivalries resurfaced. Without the constant flow of trade and coin from the continent, towns withered and people turned back to the land. Britain was now on its own, isolated, fragmented, vulnerable. From the north, the fierce Picts pressed against Hadrian's wall. From the west, Irish raiders crossed the sea in swift boats, and from across the eastern waters came new peoples, the Saxons, the Angles, the Jutes, first as mercenaries, then as conquerors. This is the story of a land abandoned by empire, of a people left to face invasion, war, and rebirth. It is the story of how Roman Britain crumbled into ruins, and how from those ruins a patchwork of kingdoms would rise. When the last legionaries marched away, they left behind more than empty forts. They left behind a people unprepared for life without Rome. For centuries, Roman rule had brought order. There was coin to pay soldiers, grain imported from overseas, law enforced by governors and magistrates. The Britons had grown used to that security, perhaps too used to it. Now, the coins stopped coming. The markets began to fail. Merchants who once traded wine, oil, and pottery from Gaul no longer crossed the channel. Stone towns, once bustling with soldiers and officials, fell eerily silent. The great villas of the countryside, symbols of wealth and Roman civilization, were abandoned or burned. And in this vacuum, fear spread. The northern tribes, the Picts, pressed ever deeper into former Roman lands. Across the Irish Sea, the Scotti raided the western shores, and from the east came whispers of new enemies, the Saxons. At first, just small bands of raiders, but each year the attacks grew bolder. The Britons tried to resist. Local chieftains rose as defenders, mustering farmers and peasants into militias. They built wooden palisades on old hill forts, lit watchfires, and stood where Roman garrisons once had. But without the discipline of Rome's legions, these defences were fragile. Every victory was fleeting, every defeat devastating. By the middle of the 5th century, Roman Britain no longer existed. The mosaic floors were cracked, the roads overgrown, the towns deserted. What remained was a land fractured, a people clinging to survival in a world that had turned dark and uncertain. Out of the chaos of Britain's collapse rose new leaders, men who called themselves kings, though their power seldom reached beyond a valley or a few villages. Among them was a figure remembered in later chronicles as Vortigern. Faced with endless raids from the Picts and the Irish, Vortigern sought a desperate solution. He invited warriors from across the sea, Germanic mercenaries, strong and skilled in battle, to fight as allies in exchange for land. The newcomers were the Saxons, joined soon by the Angles and the Jutes. They came from the coasts of what is now Germany, Denmark, and northern Holland. At first, They were few, bands of warlike settlers carving out small enclaves along the eastern shore. But as the years passed, more ships arrived. Not just warriors, but families. Entire communities crossed the sea, bringing their language, their gods, their way of life. Britain, already fractured, was changing forever. What began as an alliance soon turned into conquest. The Saxons realized the weakness of the Britons, and their hunger for land grew. Conflicts flared into open war. Villages burned, fields were seized, the old Roman towns abandoned to ruin. The Britons fought back fiercely, rallying around warlords who tried to hold the invaders at bay. One battle in particular entered legend, the Battle of Mount Badon, sometime in the late 5th century. The details are lost to time, its location unknown, its leaders uncertain. But later, writers claimed it was a great British victory, a moment when the tide of Saxon conquest was briefly halted. Some even linked it to a figure of myth, a warrior who would inspire centuries of stories, a leader remembered as Arthur. Whether Arthur was a man, a myth, or many men whose deeds became one legend, we cannot know. But his tale reflects a truth. For a time, the Britons resisted. They did not fall without a fight, yet resistance could not stop migration. Through the 6th century, the Angles and Saxons spread deeper into the land. In the fertile east and south, their settlements grew into kingdoms. Timber halls rose where Roman villas had crumbled. New languages were spoken in place of Latin and Celtic, and old gods, Woden, Thuna and Tu, were worshipped beneath the open sky. By the dawn of the 7th century, much of eastern and southern Britain had become Anglo-Saxon England. The native Britons were driven west into Wales, Cornwall, and the mountains of the north. What had once been a Roman province was now a land of migrants, warlords, and rising kingdoms. And in this struggle between Briton and Saxon, history gave birth not only to nations, but to legends that still echo in our imagination. By the 6th century, the chaos of invasion had given way to something new. The scattered bands of Saxon, Angle, and Jute settlers began to unite. Small warlords rose into kings, and from the turmoil of constant war, the first kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon Britain emerged. Later generations would remember this age as the time of the Heptarchy, the 7 great realms that came to dominate the land. To the southeast lay Kent, among the first to rise, close to the continent and rich with trade. Along the southern coast stretched Sussex and Essex, their names echoing their Saxon founders. In the fertile heartlands grew Mercia, destined to be a mighty power. Farther north, the kingdom of Northumbria spread across vast lands, from the Humber to the Firth of Forth. To the east stood East Anglia, home of the Angles themselves. And in the southwest, Wessex, the land of the West Saxons, a kingdom that in centuries to come would play a fateful role in the making of England. But these were not fixed, stable nations. They were realms of shifting borders, where kings rose and fell by the sword. Rivalry was constant, alliances fragile, and every generation saw new wars for dominance. While the Saxon kingdoms grew, the native Britons were far from gone. Driven from the east, they held their ground in the west, in Wales, in Cornwall, and in the rugged lands of Strathclyde. There, old Celtic traditions endured, and kings ruled who traced their lineage back to the world before Rome. Though divided and pressured, the Britons remained a stubborn presence, their resistance shaping the frontier between Saxon and Celt for centuries. This was an age of uncertainty, but also of creation. New laws were written, new customs forged, languages shifted. Latin gave way to Old English, a tongue born of the Angles and Saxons. Old gods were still worshipped. Yet whispers of a returning faith, Christianity, began to stir once more. Britain was no longer Roman, and not yet England. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, rising, colliding, and redefining the island itself. For generations after Rome's fall, the old gods of the Anglo-Saxons ruled Britain. Woden, Thunor, Tew, spirits of war, thunder, and fate. The churches of Roman days lay in ruins, their crosses toppled, their altars forgotten. But in the year 597, a new mission began. From Rome itself, Pope Gregory the Great sent a monk named Augustine across the sea. His task was simple yet monumental: to bring the light of Christianity back to the pagan kingdoms of Britain. Augustine landed in Kent, where fortune favoured him. The King of Kent, Ethelbert, had married a Frankish Christian queen, Bertha, who quietly kept her faith alive. Through her influence, Augustine was welcomed. Soon the king himself converted, and with him, many of his people. The old Roman faith had returned, taking root first in the south. From Kent, the new religion spread north. But Christianity was not entirely absent there. In the wild lands of Ireland and the Western Isles, the faith had never died. Celtic monks, fiery and austere, had carried the gospel across the sea, founding monasteries in Scotland and Northumbria. On the island of Lindisfarne, they built a sacred centre of prayer and learning. It was here that scribes illuminated manuscripts, and here that a new Christian culture flourished. Yet the Celtic church was not the same as the Roman one. They clashed over customs, from the date of Easter to the style of the tonsure. For decades, two Christian traditions coexisted uneasily in Britain. The conflict came to a head in 664 at the Synod of Whitby. There, kings and clergy gathered to decide the future of the faith in England. After long debate, they chose to follow the authority of Rome. The Celtic Church bent to the decision, and from that moment, Christianity in Britain stood united under the Roman tradition. This unity gave rise to a golden age of learning. In Northumbria, scholars like the Venerable Bede recorded the history of the English peoples. Monasteries became centres of art, knowledge, and power. From the ashes of Rome's departure, a new spiritual order had taken shape. Britain was no longer only a land of warlords and kings. It had become a land of saints and scholars, where faith bound together what conquest had divided. By the 8th century, the patchwork of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had matured. What had begun as fragile settlements of migrants was now a rich and complex society. Across the land, monasteries thrived. They were not only places of prayer, but centres of art, learning, and culture. On the island of Lindisfarne, monks crafted illuminated manuscripts whose beauty still endures. In Northumbria, the scholar Bede wrote his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, a work that preserved the memory of Britain's past and gave its peoples a sense of shared identity. Kings, too, grew more powerful. Among them rose the might of Mercia, a kingdom in the heart of England. Under King Offa, Mercia became the dominant power, stretching its influence across rivals. So great was his authority that Offa ordered the building of Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork stretching for miles, marking the frontier between Saxon England and the Celtic lands of Wales. It was both a barrier and a symbol, a declaration of power carved into the very earth. This was a time of political rivalry, yet also of remarkable stability. For the first time since Rome's departure, the kingdoms of Britain seemed secure. Faith, learning, and kingship flourished together. But beyond the seas, change was stirring. New sails were being built, new warriors gathering, and soon the peace of Britain would be shattered by raiders from the north. The age of the Vikings was about to begin. 4 centuries earlier, Britain had been a province of Rome, its roads straight, its towns orderly, its people living beneath the shadow of an empire. Now, that world was gone. The legions had vanished, The villas crumbled, the Latin tongue faded into silence. In its place, something new had taken shape. A land divided into kingdoms, Kent, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and more. A land where the old Celtic peoples endured in Wales, Cornwall, and the north. Even as Saxon and Anglo rule spread across the heart of Britain, it was a Britain of warriors and warlords, saints and scholars, where the cross of Christianity rose again among the ruins of pagan altars, where kings carved their names into the soil and monks carved their words into books that would outlast them all. This was no longer Roman Britain. This was the beginning of England. Its people were forging a new identity, born of conquest, faith, and survival. But history does not rest. Even as the kingdoms flourished, a new shadow gathered beyond the horizon. In the cold seas of the north, ships were being built. Ships that would carry warriors whose fury would test everything Britain had become. The storm was coming. The age of the Vikings was about to begin. And if fate allows, I will tell you that story. But fate, for me, is uncertain. My voice may not last, my body may not endure. So hear these words while I can still speak them, for I am Elias Werner, and until my breath fails, I will bring you the echoes of history.